Hello, friends. It's 10-ish Redmond time, and that means it's time, or on a Tuesday, so it's time for .NET API reviews. We are in the red, as always. And we have an agenda order that doesn't quite match the order on the screen, but it's close enough, so we'll just go ahead and get started. So we have first up a previously approved API, the SP800-108 counter HMAC cryptographic algorithm. But during the pull request, there was a lot of discussion on can we come up with a more general name for the package so that we don't have to have a package for literally every algorithm that we end up exposing to .NET Standard. So, I don't know, Tobe, Kevin, Levi, whoever wants to talk. You're up.
I mean, you summed up my concerns. Just seemed like we are creating a package just for this, and we seem to be on a path towards at some point in the next year having another one or two algorithms, I imagine, and we don't want a package for each. So a name that, more generally describes the category of stuff would be beneficial, just like we have a system IO hashing for all of our out-of-band hashing algorithms. Something for all of our out-of-band cryptographic algorithms would be valuable. There was a suggestion on the thread for system security cryptography extensions. You could do that, or system security cryptography algorithms, or
Cryptography algorithms was the name of the implementation library in .NET Core 1 through 7 or 6. So algorithms is hard. We've already burned all the good names.
Didn't Sean Farkas at one point, like many years back, make an out-of-band DLL that had AES GCM in it? Like, what was the name of that DLL? Wonder if we could resurrect that name.
What is the GCM?
It's a form of the AES encryption algorithm that also does authentication, in addition to just encryption. I'm looking at the source code right now. It was literally just called security.cryptography. They just dropped the system.prefix in front. Okay, so we don't want to do that, obviously.
Yeah. And that was his demo library for what he wanted to introduce in the next version.
Yeah.
Because the problem, I mean, we can call it extensions, but extensions feels like extension types to me. Granted, we also have the Microsoft.extensions, which means literally nothing. So extensions can be proven to be literally nothing.
It's not nothing, it's anything.
Did we decide whether this would even be inbox or just fully OOB? The only consumer I am aware of across all of .NET that would actually need to use it is ASP.NET.
I mean, at the platform layer, we have the ability to take whatever's in the NuGet package and say on the platform it type forwards to an inbox implementation. But right now, this is just fully OOB.
Okay.
But if we, to take AES GCM as an example, if we decide that we need to retroactively expose that to Net Standard 2.0, then we would add GCM to whatever this package is, and then have it type forward into the platform.
So why does this default to if we don't have a consumer for it?
Well, ASP.NET would want to consume it. Right now they have their own internal copy.
But they don't need it, right?
They'd consume it from .NET 8, right?
Yes, they would.
So then we don't have an OOP consumer.
Well, it would be part of their SDK as opposed to the core runtime. We've done that before if needed.
It would be people that Microsoft Crypto Board tells to use this algorithm that are not yet over on core. It's the reason it's Net Standard 2.0 in the first place. ASP.NET's a customer we can name.
I envision this kind of, as far as packaging wise, kind of resembling what we do with the PKCS one, where it's OOB for, .NET Core's SDK, but inbox for ASP.NETs.
Is this a fully managed implementation, or are there native dependencies from this?
For Windows, it has native dependencies. For other platforms, it's fully managed. The reason for that is on Windows, I believe the crypto folks would prefer we use the Windows implementation instead of our managed shim.
You also get a nice perf gain when you're using the internal implementation.
But you're invoking, you're not shipping a DLL, right?
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
I guess
so
I'm
that
just
doesn't
wondering,
count
like,
as-
if this is the only reason we'd ship it down level is for some future potential folks that might be told they should be looking at this. I mean, could we say it's open source, copy and paste until you're on .NET 8, but .NET Core is the way forward? All the new stuff we do is .NET Core?
That doesn't work for things like component governance.
Help me understand that.
So we have many, like probably a dozen or more, like internal partners who are asking for this. We have lots of internal interest in this. And we have been telling them historically, literally just copy and paste the implementation, throw it into your code. But at that point, it now makes them responsible for keeping track of changes, security updates, things like that, which interferes with the normal processes that we have in place to keep your code up to date. Normally, the process is just pull in a package, and then that package only has to be tracked centrally, in one place. And then everybody who's consuming the package will be alerted automatically. There's an update, please pull it down. If you're copying the code manually, you don't get that.
Right, I get that there's a benefit to a centralized implementation, but we don't have this yet. So for someone who's been told to use this, what do they currently do? They have their own copy, right?
They currently, through much kicking and screaming and gritting of teeth, copy the ASP.NET implementation.
Right. And they're successful. They may not be as successful as we'd like them to be, but not working for component governments is a scale there.
There are compliance requirements that are making copying code much more difficult going forward.
Okay, but forget copying.
Yeah.
If we didn't ship this, they'd have to write their own.
Yes, and historically people get it wrong. That's why we're being asked to make it.
But they would still do it. Like I'm just focusing on the component government part. Like, yes, there is a benefit to doing it, but like saying what I heard you say, and I maybe I put words in your mouth, is we have to do it for component government reasons, and I don't believe that's true.
No, we don't have to. Anybody can. Like anybody within the company probably could just throw up a package that does this, and make it widely available. We are the best positioned to actually create it, to actually create a good package that does this, and to have it give the performance and reliability and support characteristics that people would expect, especially because at least one of our inbox components, ASP.NET, already uses it.
I mean, I'm kind of amenable to the idea that, amortized, we lower the cost by saying there is some party at Microsoft that does the work and make sure the right things happen. That I can buy. What I want to avoid, though, is that we basically ship things proactively out of band without actually having a list of hard requirements, right? Because we generally said we don't do that, right? Generally, we say things go in the new version of the platform, and if you want to get the feature, you basically consume it by getting a new version of .NET Core, right?
There are email threads, which you're probably not on, where we are being requested in very strong terms to do this and make it available down level. I can forward those to you if you want.
So that's kind of what I asked earlier, right? I don't mean to push back on this particular component, right? All I'm saying is that unless, like, it sounded a bit in the beginning that we don't have one yet, we just expect one to have. And
no, we have people lined up to use this.
We just can't name them on a public call.
Yes.
Okay, that's totally fine then. Then let's just say that, and then I'm totally on board with this. I just want to avoid this kind of like, I guess, philosophy of saying, oh, this can be out of band. We probably might want to have it out of band at some point, so let's just start with that. That's the only thing I'm challenging as a philosophy, because we generally said, no, we have reverted that to inbox first, inbox only, unless we know for a fact that that doesn't work.
Yes, and we know for a fact that doesn't work.
Then that's fine.
I agree it's fine, but I'm also semi-pushing back on certain areas of our platform having blanket exemptions from the whole .NET Core is the way forward thing.
I'm fine with that. I would also like to make system text JSON .NET Core only going forward, and everything else that we make that standard. If that's our policy going forward, then great. That makes me happy, and I'll support it.
Yeah, to be clear, that's not what I heard from Levi. I don't think what he said was security is exempt from this. I think what I heard was, well, we have a lot of internal partners that will need it, and they can make that case successfully in the same way that the Azure SDK made that successfully for system text.json. And then, as long as the OOP is reasonable, according to the document that we put together a few years ago, we will do it. It's just that we don't default to that, right? I think that seems fine to me.
The other thing from my own personal perspective is that if we continue providing all these new things out of band, it de-incentivizes internal partners from moving forward and keeps them on legacy crud.
See, that
And
one I don't buy.
and
And the reason I don't buy that is because so far I've never seen a single case where that actually holds. Like all the people that were stuck on an older version are not stuck there because, oh, I have all the features I need. I don't see the value moving forward. It's usually I can't move because there's this super expensive system that I don't know how to move forward. And I think that's like usually for .NET Framework reasons, it's not for .NET Core reasons. Like for .NET Core, it usually comes down to, yeah, we will upgrade and it's fine if it's in a year from now. We don't see the urgency, but we also fine waiting for the feature. It's usually the .NET Framework customers that are like, well, I'd like to move. I don't know how. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So
right,
I'm stuck.
but even for both of those cases, there becomes a point where the features missing and the manual parts you have to maintain, even things like I have to copy source code and maintain my own component governance and things like that, it eventually adds up and causes the tipping point to change to it is cheaper for us to do the work to move to .NET Core than it is to continue staying on this legacy crud.
I think there's no feature you can hold back to make partners like Visual Studio move to Core.
No, but there's a culmination of total features.
Yeah,
there's
but
no
that might
one
be the next
feature,
40
but there's a
years.
culmination.
So I have a concrete example. There are teams that actually ship as part of the operating system that literally cannot take a dependency on .NET Core because our support policy is too narrow for .NET Core. They're required to stay on .NET Framework because it is supported for the same length as the operating system itself. Those teams would need a package that runs down level.
Which several core components of the operating system have done so far, including Notepad, Calculator, and other things. They've all made the transition where feasible to provide a newer out of box experience that comes in through the store. So it's definitely not impossible, even for things that are considered core and ship with the OS.
You're talking apps as opposed to services, but yeah.
So
yeah, but that's still a similar thing where eventually services will need to move
right.
to a newer model.
So we're not really here to talk about our general policy of packaging, and we have in fact previously discussed and decided collectively that this met the bar for net standard packaging. What we're here trying to discuss right now is the name for this package.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think we can have a separate discussion on the policies, but I have to say, like, I mean, we already agreed on the policy at a high level with our directors like a year ago, 2 years ago, right? So I don't think we need to change that.
So back to my original premise, am I correct or wrong that we would expect there will be more crypto algorithms coming down the pike?
There have been one-off requests for authenticated AES to be somehow exposed and supported by the .NET Runtime team beyond the package that Sean Farkas made available a while back, which hasn't been updated in a decade. So you could imagine that if there is, critical mass behind those requests, the API would also be added to this library.
Yeah, like Azure has asked us to make AES GCM available as Net Standard 2.0. We've helped them deal with their cross-compiling concern. It's come up one or two other times. Right now, our big advantage is, from a political clout perspective, is no single person has enough political clout to justify our engineering effort. And internally, GCM is a, by default, banned algorithm. You have to convince CryptoBoard that you're smart enough to use it correctly before they'll let you use it. And so we don't have a lot of people who want it. It's the closest candidate, and I certainly see the possibility of other things popping in, but I don't know. There's nothing waiting in the wings, which is why I didn't have an obvious name when we came up with this previously.
Do we have any existing out-of-band names despite the one from Sean?
I mean, in Core 1, everything was out of band. But the only thing we have left in crypto that's an out-of-band package is called System Security Cryptography PKCS. Oh, sorry, also System Security Cryptography XML, System Security Cryptography Cozy, and do we have another one?
Protected data.
Oh, yes, Protected Data.
I mean, I'm generally hesitant with like DCL level components to ship them in a basically. I mean, the Azure SDK multiple times said, can you have like a catch-all out-of-band package for system components? And I'm hesitant to do that because of layering concerns, right? But it seems to me all of crypto is effectively at the same level. So a layer, you could basically put them all together in one big block probably, right? Because the amount of dependencies, it's either it's in managed code and p invokes, or it calls into a native thing that ships with it, right? If you're on non-Windows platforms, right? Which should be relatively fine. I mean, we could continue doing this thing where we ship basically system cryptography dot feature name, and then we have like an ever-growing set of assembly names. That I'm not a huge fan of, but it's certainly the pattern that we have used elsewhere. So is there any other downside of just having a catch-all crypto package?
Not really. If we were still doing the Net Core 2 layering, where we had, we were being hybrid of everything exists as a NuGet package, also it's in the platform. This would have gone in system security cryptography algorithms, and we'd be figuring out, or we would have had to figure out in 3 or 5 or whenever we got rid of all those, all of that wave of packages of, well, what package do we put this in now? So it would have just gone straight in algorithms.
I was going to ask, why not just do that now?
Put it where?
Dot algorithms. Like, the package still exists. Right now, it just kind of forwards everywhere.
So we can resurrect the package name. It'll be weird in our build system because we still have to build a thing called algorithms for core for retargeting, which shouldn't go in, that shouldn't go in the package. It's so we'd have an assembly and a package, and they would be unrelated.
You could pick a new name, right? It doesn't have to be an existing one, right?
Right. I mean, we could be weird and just call it Algos, but.
Well, I wouldn't play tricks like that, but I think if you go with some generic, I mean, if you either go with system security cryptography SP800-108, I don't know, or you go with something that is stuff effectively, right? And then you can put more algorithms later in there, which I think I would prefer, because unless we know already that there might be layering issues, it just seems better than to invent new assemblies forever going forward.
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Levi.
I was going to say ASP.NET calls their package .key derivation. But anyway.
Yeah, but
I was going to say, to Eric's point in chat, we've recently or quote, quote, recently, Microsoft.bcl.async interfaces, Microsoft.bcl.hashcode, Microsoft.bcl.async, things where we're basically taking something that was from the core libraries and making them available down level. We've put them in this Microsoft.bcl.whatever. Can we do that here? If we ship this in box, can we have that be if you really need this down level, go grab this other package that's Microsoft.bcl.whatever?
I'm fine with that. This package is only for people that, for whatever reason, can't upgrade.
I think that was the intent of the name, right? We specifically picked the quote-unquote ugly name to separate it from, proper oops, I guess. Right? This is kind of backwards compat only things, like polyfills. But it does free up the problem that we had a bunch of package names already in existence in .NET Core v1, right?
So are you suggesting that this would be fully OOB and not have any type of type forwards or anything else? It would just be straight up net standard?
No,
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the reason we picked an ugly name is to kind of underline the message, right? Which is, this is not a first-class citizen, right? As in we do it as a backwards compat, right? But to Tanner's point, right? it is very difficult for people to realize, okay, this is a fully supported, always out of band component that just happens to ship inbox. It's very different from, oh yeah, this is an inbox first component, and then there is some polyfill down level, right? Even though there might be type forwards in it to make compat work, but we try to de-emphasize those as sexy names by removing the system prefix from them.
And my suggestion was effectively, we're adding a type that we already know is going to be in a shared framework, at least as far as I understood it. It's just a question of whether it's in the ASP.NET shared framework or the runtime shared framework, at which point, let's just put it in the shared framework. It's part of .NET 8. And then there's this separate package where if you really need it down level, well, okay, we're making available the supported thing, and it type forwards just like iasync enumerable does from Microsoft.bcl.async interfaces, whatever we call that thing.
That seems fine.
Jeremy's face tells me that he's not fine with that name.
No, I'm just like, I mean, it seems a little weird. So with all those Microsoft BCL blanks, we do get type unification, right? It's not a clone of the type. It's just an alternative packaging. So it's a type forward into core. I mean, we can certainly do that here. We could add this to the System Security Cryptography DLL, and then we could make, Microsoft BCL cryptography, and have it give a net standard compatible version of this algorithm plus the net framework special version of this.
Why would we not want to just add, like, forgetting separate packaging for a moment, why would we not want this to be in System Security Cryptography DLL? What are the downsides?
From I don't know, I guess it's a philosophy question of, do we want everything to always be inbox, or do we believe in NuGet and layering?
I mean, it's from what I heard, it is going to be inbox.
Right. I guess that's true. Yes, because ASP.NET will be using it as an implementation detail. It'll be inbox. At which point we should just put it in ours and save on the extra 50K or whatever it is of an assembly overhead.
I mean, this is kind of why I'm pushing us to not think OOP first. Like, I really want us to think of, if everything is inbox, what is the correct assembly to put stuff in, right? Because the lessons learned for me, at least for .NET Core V1, was that we had this massive explosion of assembly names because we wanted to support, an open-ended set of layerings and, reshuffling of the platform, because that's what we just did, right? But if we stop doing that, which I think we kind of started doing because it was unmaintainable, you want layering, but you want layering in 12 things, not in 400 things, right? And so that's kind of why it makes sense to, from at least from my point of view, to say, well, all the crypto algorithms are similar in the sense that they either call into native code or they call into platform, OS provided code. So we can put them all in one assembly, right? Because I really don't see us shipping a new version of .NET where we arbitrarily remove some of the algorithm.
Like Emo's wording back here. SP800-108 would be a reasonable package name.
I think that was the note. I think, I mean, everything in crypto seems reasonable naming-wise to me. So that's kind of why I was saying, if we do it out of band, I'm okay with using a shittier name. We should still type forward to the inbox version, but I think I don't think in the inbox one we need to burn a new assembly for that.
Okay, so Kevin, from an implementation perspective, if we add this inbox in 8, we'd have all the span stuff in 8, but if we polyfill it to standard, we'd still need to write the core with spans for 7 and whatever else are in support, right?
I don't know. The whole matrix of span and tuple and stuff with this package, I had to drink a half a gallon of coffee to stop getting migraines from doing all that in my head. I think the other one for this packaging, though, is this package also builds for Net Core App previous. So if you look at the proj file for this one, what would this package do if it, since we typically target Net Core App current, plus we usually target Net Core App previous, which we're doing in other packages. Net Core App previous isn't Net Core 8, so that would mean the package would still need a full copy of the Net Core implementation to support the Net Core App previous target.
Unless we didn't care and said they just get to do the net standard implementation.
Yes, at the cost of probably getting a less efficient implementation.
Yeah,
Because that's where all the span and
If you're
stuff,
already on
gymnastics.
if you're already on .NET 7, there's a really good chance you're moving to .NET 8 very soon.
What about .NET 6?
Do we provide with this? We said previous framework. Would it also have one for .NET 6 and .NET 7?
I think there's two. There's Net Core App previous and Net Core App minimum. Minimum is 6.
I mean, if we did all three, I'd make the same argument. Like, if you're on .NET 6, you're already on the latest LTS. There's a good chance you're going to move to .NET 8 sometime in the year after .NET 8 ships, and the package wouldn't even be available until November anyway. If you're on .NET 7, you're not even waiting for LTS, and so you'll probably move to .NET 8 soon after it comes out. So spending a lot of effort creating an optimized implementation for .NET 6 and .NET 7 doesn't seem like an important thing to me.
Yeah, I mean, most of the callers that we expect are ASP.NET, who will be on 8 and get the inbox version, and a bunch of people who are on framework, so they'll get the framework version. And yeah, if we get 6 and 7, we could add those later, but we can probably just get away with letting them be the net standard fallback.
Those arguments are great.
I also caveat that by saying I have zero understanding of exactly how and where this is used. Like, I have no idea if this represents 99% of your computing costs or like 0.001%.
It's actually, it's very rare to have this be the bottleneck because you generally use it before a cryptographic operation, and the operation that comes second tends to be the longer running one. That said, we don't want to force people to bring in dependencies that they don't need to have. Right? Like, isn't that why we cross-compile for Net 4.6.2 or whatever it is? So that people don't...
You mean the concern of bringing in like the value tuple assembly and
net standard and a bunch of other stuff.
System.memory, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, on full framework, system memory and friends are going to come anyway, so whatever. But I meant bringing in like net standard.dll, for instance. I know that we try to avoid that where possible.
No, the only external package that the net standard implementation needs is the system memory one for net standard, because that's part of the public API service.
Yeah, because it uses spans. And the cost of the net standard implementation is great. You gave us a span from a platform that supports them, and we have to copy it to an array because all of the types we're working with don't have spans in their surface.
Right. I mean, it seems like there's basically three categories of things we're considering here. There's .NET 8 gets the best implementation and no additional dependencies. There's .NET 7/.NET 6, which also doesn't have any additional dependencies, but might not have the absolute fastest implementation. And then there's the net standard one, which by definition, given the API surface area, needs all these additional dependencies and won't have as good an implementation. But that seems like a fine situation to me.
Yes.
Okay. So, are we calling it Microsoft BCL cryptography?
Security cryptography, I believe. Because we tend to replace system with Microsoft BCL, right? Which means we still need the security infix.
Sort of. I mean, we have this Microsoft BCL async interfaces.
Oh, never mind. Never mind. Yeah.
Do we imagine there being a cryptography that's not security?
Probably not. Yeah.
I mean, the question would be if we add a Microsoft BCL security that's not cryptography. It's should they be layered the way they are in the namespaces?
That's right.
I don't care.
For your bullets on 31 through 33, we are saying, though, that we are going to build for net core app previous and net core app minimum as well, because I see standard is represented, framework is represented, and there is .NET 8, which will type forward.
Yeah, 6 and 7 gets net standard 2.0's implementation.
Yeah, I think it basically ends up being some CS proj manipulation to make sure the right dependencies are set up, and the fact that the package has an extra binary, but there shouldn't be any additional like code implementation specific to .NET 6 or .NET 7. Right? We won't have three. We won't have three implementations in the package. There'll be the type forwards for .NET 8, and there'll be a net standard implementation, which will also compile into the .NET 6, .NET 7 build.
Okay.
Right. So if you do a package restore and you're targeting net 7, it won't find anything in the net core line that's compatible, and it'll fall back to net standard. It'll find that one, and it'll pick that implementation.
Oh, that's not what I was thinking, actually. Because if we do that, then it ends up picking up the dependencies. It needs to load the system dot value tuple, whatever, right? And it needs to load the system dot memory. I thought we were basically special casing .NET 6 and .NET 7 to avoid loading a bunch of additional dependencies. If we don't want to do that, that's fine. I thought that's what people were saying they wanted.
I thought your argument was that this wouldn't even ship until November, and at that point, people were probably going to upgrade anyway.
That was, and then I heard concerns about not just throughput, but also assembly.
For framework, we've always been building our packages, always targeting framework special, so that they can avoid the indirection of loading all the type forwards through net standard DLL. Or at least that's what I think the reason is. Like, that it massively simplifies the package graph for NetFX targeting and the process load time.
The Net Framework's going to get an entirely different implementation than .NET Standard, because Net Framework is Windows and that uses CNG. Net Standard is going to be managed only.
Wait, why would we do it that way? If someone's using Net Standard on .NET Framework, you don't want them picking up...
Well, the application is either Net Framework or Net Core.
But there could be a library that depends on this that's Net Standard.
Right, but when the application restores, if it's for Net Framework, it'll pull the Net Framework implementation and just use CNG. The only thing that would pull the Net Standard implementation would be UAP, unless that falls back to NetFX. But so UAP, Unity, and Net 6 and Net 7. Those are the only things that ever use a Net Standard implementation.
Before we go too far down this rabbit hole, I want to clarify that this will be a at runtime decision whether you get the CNG or the managed implementation. So yes, the Net Framework and Net Standard could possibly just be the same thing, since we have to do runtime detection anyways. Because for Net Standard, we got rid of the platform, Net Standard -Windows, Net Standard -Mac OS, etc. So it will do the right thing on Net Standard.
That's what I was thinking. I'm also I'm obviously wrong based on your explanation, Germany, but I really thought there were situations where you could end up with a Net Standard implementation while running on .NET Framework, due to a series of dependencies that build one assembly into another package.
If you use NuGet through MS Build to build your application, then no. If you do weird things and copy DLLs by hand, then you can do whatever.
Right.
But a library basically is only ever going to pull the ref, and we're going to have a unified ref for as long as we can manage that. So we'll have a unified ref. So library compiles will only ever see that. And then when you're an application, you can't build a Net Standard application. So when you do the application's final restore, and it looks at things and says, oh, I can throw away all of this nonsense out of the package that isn't relevant to my application, you end up in the runtime assets only having the NetFX or the Net Core, or if neither of those applied to your build, the Net Standard implementation. But so Net 8 would never see the Net Standard build, and NetFX would never see the Net Standard build. It's only the holes in the graph.
Begs the question, would we have a Net Standard build?
So that'd be if you pulled it on Net 7 or you pulled it on Net 6 or you're running on Unity or UAP.
Well,
If we
that's-
didn't ship a .NET 6 build.
Right, and then so if we did also ship it as not as Net 6 instead of, or yeah, if we did an implementation for Net 6 and 7, and a type forward for 8, then the net standard build would only then get used by Unity and UAP.
I mean, it's this other thing, right? Even if you only target full framework and core, right? Some people just like using net standard in order to avoid multi-targeting, right?
But that's when they build their application. I'm saying when NuGet does its restore, which implementation assembly do you end up with? Only Unity or UAP would end up with the net standard 2. I mean, technically, or people that are running unsupported on Net Core 3.
I mean, older versions of core aside, I think Stephen was suggesting that we don't produce a .NET Standard asset at all, and I'm saying the downside to not doing that is basically you prevent anybody from using Net Standard as a single project to reach both of these platforms we care about.
That matters for the ref. So what we've done in some places is have NetFX and NetCore be implemented in Net Standard, be PNSE, just to tell the NuGet graph we did something here, and then we got complaints that we broke UAP.
Maybe I misunderstood what Stephen was suggesting. I mean, basically what you're saying is you could have a turd assembly for net standard. I think that's fine. But I think what he was suggesting is not having any asset ref or impl for net standard.
I was asking what would happen if you didn't have net standard at all.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
Yeah, we
And I'm saying that
accidentally
this
did that for protected data, and we found out pretty quickly that people are in those situations. Like, even what was it, protected data, we accidentally made the net standard 2.0 implementation PNSE, and people are like, this broke my app in UWP.
Right. I mean, granted, this would be a net new type, so it would be, this didn't work yesterday on UAP, it doesn't work today on UAP. So we have more wiggle room here, but if we do care about people on Unity, if they're in our current scope of caring for this, then they would also only ever get the net standard asset until Unity finally gets unified. Or united, if you prefer.
I mean, technically anybody supports net standard 2 effectively will always get the net framework asset as a fallback.
Yeah, and that's what ASP.NET would do. Because ASP,
but
yeah. So ASP.NET's crypto libraries also ship as a fully OOB net standard compliant package. They actually target net standard 2.0, and they would be a candidate for consuming this. Does that change the calculus?
I don't think so. I think it just means we have the original plan if there's a net standard asset.
Yeah, I guess it's not actually a unified ref because the ref's what we actually split for net framework.
I mean, maybe I missed this, but was there any is there any complexity of implementing net standard 2.0, or is it just that we said we could make it go everywhere? Because we only care about net framework and net core.
It's already done, so.
Yeah, I mean, so doing it with this compatibility package does create some engineering difficulty with sharing the code with the implementation and system security cryptography, but I guess we already have shared source and common source system security cryptography, so it can just live there.
I mean, that's regardless of the package name or philosophy about it, that's the case in any situation where we have it both inbox and out of band, right?
Yes. Well, depends on if it's the whole library is in that shape or if it's only pieces.
Sure.
This one being only pieces is what makes it complicated. Because the package and it would be the same for any type that we've moved inbox, basically.
Wait, Levi, you just said something in chat that wasn't what I didn't understand. You said ASP.NET's crypto library is fully OOB, and that's the dependency. So that means it's ASP.NET's dependency for this is not in its shared framework?
No. I meant like ASP.NET's crypto framework can be installed in an application as a fully OOB package.
Oh, okay.
It is also included as part of the ASP.NET framework.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so do we think it's appropriate to be continuing to discuss in this meeting care about net 6 and 7 perf, which would be the only thing that we would build lower, or do we just start with .NET 8 and keep the package smaller until people bang on our doors?
I would do that.
Agree.
Just to clarify, though, will we actually have a target framework for Net Core App Previous and Net Core App Minimum, but they're just identical implementations to Net Standard?
No, we would leave them out.
So they would just be completely left out. Okay.
The target platforms would just say Net Standard, Net Framework, whatever, and then
so it would be Net,
and then
it would
the
be
complicated
Net Core App Current.
Net 8 because we want it to stay Net 8, and I don't know how we do that, but
frankly, I honestly don't care either way. So if there's any complexity, if Victor says, wait, why are we differentiating this from our other ones? Like, let's just add the Net 6 and Net 7 ones. If it doesn't make a difference, let's save the size.
I agree. Yeah, size unless Victor says otherwise.
It's got a lot more complicated from a grep that I can do in 20 minutes.
Sorry,
But it'll be better.
What's the complication?
It's I'm just kind of not saying anything useful here other than I was really hoping this would just be quite a bit of a simple package rename, but now we have to do a considerable amount of shuffling around.
The complication, I think, Kevin, is this will be the first package we've done this to in 8, and every other package, like even if it was new in 7, it would have said current, and then when we upgraded to 8, it would become previous. So you can't find the package that doesn't say previous because we haven't written one yet.
Which is another example of where if it's going to cause, if it's going to take another 4 hours of Kevin's time to figure out how to make this work, like, and having previous in there would save that 4 hours. Like, let's just add the previous. I really don't. I mean,
fair enough. I mean, we also can, if it's easier to add it and we just trim it out later, then that's easy too. But it should just be a matter of just not specifying it in the target platforms, and everything just works fine. Okay, I think we've beat this one word to
So
death.
the only thing I would make sure is that, we should make sure that we don't produce a package where we accidentally or we inject turds somewhere that we didn't intend to, right? Because that's what we have done in the past at some point, and that's generally not great.
we're really good at accidentally injecting things. It's like our bread and butter emo.
Yes, that's why I'm saying that.
I actually didn't catch that. Accidentally inject what?
So we call these assemblies that always throw turd assemblies because we're really good at naming things.
Yeah. I mean, we'd have to write the line in the project file that says generate platform not supported. Like, if we don't write that line, no turds are produced. So.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a new one on me.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever said the word in public.
It's better than PNSE because depending on how you pronounce it, that sounds worse.
Always the crypto stuff that brings out the good things.
I mean, only 50 minutes to agree on a package name. That's a good start.
Well, we did also define packaging kind of going forward for the rest of the release, so that's at least somewhat useful, assuming someone wrote it down somewhere.
I'm only partially joking, but...
Yeah, I totally thought this was going to be like 15, 20 minutes. All right. Thank you for your endurance, Kevin.
No problem. Thank you for taking the time.
You're free labor, so we appreciate you. Probably more than you appreciate us.
Cheap free labor.
Well, you're not cheap, but you are free for us.
Okay, I can speak to this one. As part of .NET 8, we want to make .NET native or native AOT ASP.NET apps, and we want them to be reasonably sized and cut out things that you don't, if you're not using a chunk of code, there's no reason for that code to be there. And so one of the places that came up is our hosting layer brings in some dependencies all the time, whether you use them or not. And so this proposal is to create an API that cuts out the things that you might not need, and then you can add them in later if you want. And so today we have host dot create default application builder, and application builder also has constructors, a default constructor as well, like a parameterless constructor that brings in all these dependencies. And the proposal here is to create a new API called create empty application builder, which has the same behavior as disable defaults, an existing setting that we have, but it doesn't bring in any of the code that you're not going to use, that you potentially aren't going to use. And so yeah, it's one method. Kind of the warts on this a little bit is we burned the parameterless constructor. Like if I was to redo this API from scratch and we didn't have anything, the empty host application builder that doesn't do anything, takes no parameters, I would make that one be the one that doesn't have anything inside of it, and we wouldn't even need this API. But and then I have some notes about like there's a almost a meg and a half size savings here, where a meg of it is just because console logger is stupid big, but that's another issue that I plan on bringing later.
So I'm slightly confused, I guess, that here you are proposing taking a host application builder settings, which totally seem sensible, but none of the other methods on host do. At least none of the relevant ones that you included.
The constructor, right? When we did so if you remember in 7, we made the application builder stuff. We made the factory methods, but also made the constructors on host application builder. And kind of, I'm not fully sure all the reasonings why exactly we did it this way. Like the default builder never had settings before.
That's basically it. Like the original proposal, I had settings overload for create application builder, but it didn't align with create default builder. And Jeremy, you seem to prefer like, you have the constructor. Like the initial proposal didn't make any of the constructors public either, but you were a fan of the constructors, and it seemed reasonable.
Okay, I mean, I guess really, so maybe the thing that you said earlier and I missed is that you wish that you could make the the default constructor on the builder, that it would have been, it was in a clean state, but instead it does stuff.
Right. Going back, we would change some things. We would also remove the disable defaults rule and all of that.
So you need to call this factory method because this constructor does what you said in your settings plus other things that you didn't ask for.
Right.
So the settings, the settings have a few things on it. Maybe I should have stuck it on there. The settings has what's your content root, what's your app name, what's your environment name. Those things are still respected in a quote unquote empty application builder. It's just the things that don't happen is there's no services added to your application by default. There's no console log. By default, we add console logging, we add environment variables to your configuration. We have app settings.json by default. None of that will happen when you use create empty application builder.
Just to play, I'm fine with the API in general. Just to play devil's advocate for a second, and you've probably discussed this. How big a breaking change would it be if we retconned the constructor the way you would have wanted it to be, such that we by default don't add console, we don't add app settings? Like, is it literally break every user of minimal APIs? Is it, a few users inconvenienced?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, keep going. Sorry, stop it.
Yeah, so I would say this is primarily used for ASP.NET as a constructor or a consumer. Sorry. So you could argue that it's not likely to break a bunch of people. However, and the big problem here is that the empty constructor isn't going to be usable by us even because like we still need to pass in settings. So, and unfortunately, like the big problem is host application builder settings like has this disable defaults property, which isn't like statically analyzable. So like we need to pass in settings because there's like initialization that happens that we can't like influence later once the constructor has completed. So like for things like changing the content route, which ASP.NET supports through its like slim web application builder and all that.
Sorry, so
Like-
I didn't totally understand.
Yeah.
How does the create empty application builder that takes the host application builder settings fix those issues, whereas the host application builder constructor that takes the host application builder settings couldn't fix those issues? Like if we were willing to take a breaking change, what doesn't make sense about doing that with the builder? Just that there's that disable method that would no longer make sense.
Right. So, I mean, there might be a way to approach what you're going for. So, like, you're saying even like the current settings
I'm
constructor, not just
purely
the
asking
empty
questions
constructor.
to basically say,
Yeah.
like, we already have two different create builders. Now we're talking about adding a third. Is there any way, and what would be the impact of retconning one of the existing approaches of creating a builder to do what we want it to do? That's basically my high level question.
We can't use the parameterless constructor because we need to take values that come from the settings. So like
We could
because
retcon the
those-
settings constructor, but yeah,
Yeah,
that's
but
extreme.
the settings has a disable defaults that if you set to false, like that would literally be obsolete and we would never be able to use that anymore.
And so
yeah, that's what we would do. We'd obsolete retcon it, and
what happens with that disable defaults when it's passed to the empty? It's a no op because the defaults were empty.
Correct. No matter what you put in there, it doesn't do anything because there are no defaults. So whether you say disable them or not, there are none.
Right. So it's a little strange to me that we're okay with that, but we wouldn't be okay with obsoleting it
Why?
because in both cases they're useless.
No, they're not useless today. Like with the existing APIs,
No.
they're not useless.
No, I understand. I'm saying with that property is useless with create empty application builder. So if we were to retcon host application builder to not add anything by default, then that method would still be useless. That parameter, whatever it is, would still be useless. And so whether we obsolete it or not, like it sort of is equivalent to create empty
Because-
application builder.
Because we would have to make a breaking change.
I understand. I'm asking how big that breaking change would be.
Like, do you think
it'd be
literally no
pretty
one's ever
big.
called it?
no,
I don't
ASP.NET.
think
So
nobody.
it'd be big for anyone who called it, right? It's not a heavily used API, but it's a substantial change. The other thing that I think is super important here is that these defaults affect like what state the constructor puts the builder in. And like I know that's like super high-minded, so let me just put it this way. Like if we retconned the existing host application builder settings to be empty and obsoleted the disabled defaults, we'd still need to add new constructors that did all the default behavior.
For existing
Because like
APIs.
it's not something we can do after it's constructed. Right, yeah.
we would like the existing ASP.NET scenarios still need to work the same way they're doing today. And so we would need to add in another API either way. Whether we
Exactly.
said let's make the breaking change for use the constructor to mean empty.
I
ASP.NET
didn't-
would also the old all the existing ASP.NET code still needs the behavior that the current constructor has today.
But there must be a way to go from create, and if you want to shut down this line of conversation, that's fine. But I just want to understand, there must be a way to go from create empty application builder with host application builder settings to the same behavior that you get today with the existing constructor. Is that a true or false statement?
It's
false.
true
And
if
that's
you
what
copy if you copy a bunch of code out.
Right. So how? It's like that code would basically be add service, add service, add service for some number of calls, right?
So
Yeah,
the
more or
problem is you can come close to going from a quote unquote empty to a default builder by adding back like a bunch of loggers and stuff like that. A lot of the defaults it adds are things that you can kind of add after the fact, but some things that you cannot do, for example, is basically change configuration sources and so forth. That would happen early. That would affect how the constructor runs.
How do you do that with the empty one we're talking about adding?
That's
You're saying you can't.
But theoretically, I mean, I don't know the API, but I'm just based on things that I hear. If you called create empty and then you called like add configuration source and then you called the add services, you would get the same behavior, right? You just need to do everything in the right order.
That's what I thought the answer was going to be, but I think Stefan was saying there are actually some things you can't achieve. Am I
right. So mostly there are the things that are configured via the settings, which you might be able to control, but mostly it's if like the default configuration sources affect content root and stuff like that, which are, even if you change the configuration sources after constructor, that's like immutable.
So forgetting the retcon thing for a second, is it a problem? Like I thought the whole point of this was basically let's allow someone to start from a completely blank slate and add what they want in, but it sounds like they can't actually do that and fully approximate what they get today.
You can get close. Yeah, and maybe that would
100%.
require some experimentation, maybe with feeding in like there's also this initial config property on settings. So like that certainly gives you some control there. But
because yeah, to me it feels like you shouldn't add API until you can add all of the API that you could call whatever the create empty is and get exactly the same thing but under your own control.
right. So like right now there's no extension method on host application builder, which is like add defaults, right? We have these.
Right, and so that's what I'm saying. Like, if this needs
yeah.
a delegate to invoke of, I'm going to give you this half-constructed thing, and you get to give me all the early configuration it's going to need, or we add a property on host application builder settings to give you the extra data, or like, but it feels like if from this you can't get to this, then we've done something wrong. To me,
I think you can. Like settings
Yeah, I think
has
it might be
configuration.
possible.
If you want environment variables, you can set those up early.
Yeah.
because
You could set
Same
up
with the content root.
listed on it.
the
Like,
question
maybe
is,
that would just set it.
is the empty one going to do anything that would read settings before you had an opportunity to register your own settings provider? If it's going to basically create it just as an empty type with like, you can now go plug in whatever config you want, then you should be able to do everything.
I think Eric's right. To approximate it, like ASP.NET Core would have to pass in the right settings initially, which wouldn't just be like an empty settings object. And then it would have to add a bunch of default services like after the fact. But in doing both steps, it should be possible. Right? That's what you're saying, Eric?
Yeah, that's what we do today in the Slim builder in ASP.NET.
Yeah.
But can we validate that? Because I mean, it would be instructional, at least for me, to see here's basically what, when you say create application builder or create default builder, if you want to do the same thing with create empty application builder, it would help me understand what the other things are actually doing. If I could see the code that you would have to write.
This is a significant breaking change, though, to anyone using the API.
And that's fair. And that's a good reason. Like, if we believe it would negatively impact people, like, that's a good reason not to do it. And just, I want to make sure when we're adding something new that this is like, you know, this is the end all be all. This is the truly empty thing that allows you to create anything.
Right.
What I still don't understand is like, why do we get away with not having these settings for create application builder or create default builder? Clearly, like they have to infer them from somewhere else then, right?
So the difference for the
two at the
iHost builder,
top, the two at the top just forward to the constructors in the class. They're literally just forward, right? Create application builder.
Okay.
They just
What
forward
does
to the two
constructor
constructors.
then do? Like it has to kind of fill in things like args and application name, right?
Yeah.
And we can't do this for the empty one?
Can't do what?
I think the problem, and I'm going to say it out loud and see if I just understand the space. So, pardon the repeating things. What you really want, sort of, is this constructor with, or rather, the problem is the trimmer, you passed in this option that says disable defaults, but even if it's true, the trimmer didn't know you were going to pass in true, so it had to keep all the types around. And then you're just carrying a bunch of types that you never actually loaded, or never actually cared about. And so the problem is you need a new method or new constructor to call it, but you can't just add a Boolean because the Boolean would only be existing to say I'm the one that is trimmer friendly. And so
Which is how
you're
we
creating a
will
new
actually do
name.
it.
Is that the space we're in?
That's exactly the space that we're in.
Okay.
Sorry, I still don't understand. Like basically, logically, what I would expect, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but the existing constructor that takes no arguments or that takes args, in my mental model, they just construct the settings and call the one that takes the settings. And you're saying that's not what happened.
No, that's exactly what happens today.
That's what happens today. He's apparently
And so
creating
far-
an internal host application builder, host application settings, bool, I'm trimmer friendly.
Empty. Bool empty.
Yeah.
And you debug that assert empty is true all the time.
Yeah, and so that's the calling the other constructor that's not introducing these types into the type graph.
And then you refactor out whatever's shared between
There's
the
no
two.
surface problem. This is a trimming and implementation problem. It's like frozen collections.
right? And like, had we thought about trimming in advance, we would have done the thing, you know, Steve wants us to retcon to, but it would be hugely breaking.
So I guess I'm not pushing back on having the method. I think the method makes sense. What I'm asking is why is the shape of the method not the same as the other methods?
You want like two more overloads that take nothing and take args?
So you're
I'm
just
basically saying, why do we have the settings one at all? Because the other two don't have it.
Settings is the more rich data type.
Right. It has args on it. It has configuration. It has content root, app name, environment name.
Yeah, I get that. But basically, when you call create application builder or create default builder, how do I set the content root path today?
I think you're right. From a discoverability perspective, now that we have the create application, empty application builder, we need to add the equivalent one for the non-empty. Like we did before because it was like redundant with the constructor. But honestly, like even before, from a discoverability perspective, I probably should have pushed back harder and been like, we should have this host application building settings overload. So like maybe we can just take that opportunity now and add it. So we can add like a host application builder settings overload for create application builder.
Yeah, I guess if they all have the same shape, I think my concern disappears. But basically what I'm asking is that clearly in the other ones, we either don't have to set the args or application name or environment name, or you can, but via a different mechanism. So I'm just confused that just because I want an empty builder, we also change the way you initialize those, because that seems kind of odd.
So do you want to copy the other two constructors for the empty one or the other two?
Well, I mean,
Static.
there's two things. One of them is basically like, why do we need the settings one at all for the empty one? And if we strongly believe we needed them, my next question is, well, why didn't we need them for the other one? And like you're saying, it would be nice to have. And I'm
So
not pushing back
both of
on
those,
that, but
both
really
of
it's
those
like,
questions are very easy to answer.
okay,
So we need the settings overload because ASP.NET needs to pass in those settings and create the empty application builder. Like there's settings on there that matter that need to be specified up front before you create the object. So we need that one.
Okay, but can you explain why you don't need it for the other ones?
For the other ones, if you wanted the settings one, we would have told you just call the constructor, second constructor on the bottom.
And there's no good constructor to add for this, right? Like we can't pick another name for the constructor.
The default builder is just the old API.
Basically, create, as I understand it, and tell me if I'm wrong, Eric, create default builder and create application builder are opinionated factories. If you don't like their opinions, today the answer is go call new host application builder, passing in whatever settings you want. The problem with that one is it then roots the world. And so to avoid rooting the world, we have to add a new one that also takes the host application builder settings. That basically says we're not going to add anything. And so it's as if you specify disable by default so that we only add in the exact things that you specify.
Exactly. And one more point I want to add about those iHost builder overloads, like why don't they need settings? And that comes down to those were two phases. So basically there was a first phase that no longer exists in host application builder where you could basically configure all those settings using like complicated callbacks that we got rid of, like configure host configuration with like a callback, and then you would add arguments and stuff. But you just can't do that anymore.
For new applications, are there valid reasons to still use create application builder or create default builder?
Yes.
If you want
the existing behavior and don't really care about size of your app, you still can call those.
And do either of them map directly to the constructors?
The top two map directly to constructor 1 and constructor 3.
And
so there's
the current implementation's on screen.
So there's no reason to use create application builder. You could just use the public constructors, and it's exactly the same.
Yes.
And how does default builder differ?
It gives you a whole different object. It's a whole different programming model of, like, iHost builder was the original one. Like Stefan was just talking about, like,
right. But
it has like all these callbacks, right?
And that's
it's not imperative.
That's not obsolete. That's like we would still encourage people to use that moving forward.
Encourage is a strong word. Like,
I mean, do you want to slap obsolete on it, Nate?
Not as part of this.
No. And in fact, there's an even older host, like to get down into it, which is like ASP.NET Core's web host, which is before we split things into Microsoft extension hosting. And that's not obsolete yet either. So we've talked about that for a few releases. Most of our new documentation shows using these newer APIs, but we haven't broken the old hosting.
It sounds like
APIs.
we are doing this every release. Maybe we should just put the .NET framework name in the API name so we at least know which one is for which version of the framework.
Create Net 8 application builder, create Net 9 application builder. I mean, in all seriousness, like we don't need to have.
Might as well.
I think the proposed API name makes sense. It makes sense to be parallel to create application builder. Effectively, we're saying one is opinionated and one is not.
Right.
It's weird then to have this third create default builder that's just sitting there creating noise if we don't actually believe that it's good for anything other than existing code still continuing to build. But that's probably a conversation for another day.
I mean, we could also just hide it. It's not quite as nice as obsoleting. But
So
I guess
the other issue is we have a template that uses create default builder.
Exactly. For several releases, for like at least from .NET 3 to 5.
We're shipping templates in .NET 8 that include that in the template.
Yes, the worker template.
Why?
Still uses create default builder.
Just because nobody's updated, or because it's the best answer?
No, it's mostly the first one, and then a little bit of iHost builder. Like, people wrote extension methods for iHost builder, and host application builder doesn't implement iHost builder because we want to move away from this callback programming model. right? Like minimal APIs, you had your main, and their main just runs top to bottom, and not like, oh, I know that configure host application gets called after this happens, but before this happens, right?
Well, it seems
Imperative
like
programming. What an interesting paradigm.
Yeah, right.
It seems like separate from this review, because this isn't something we're going to resolve here. There should be conversations about whether these APIs are hidden, obsoleted, whether the template in .NET should continue using them. Because if the answer is yes, we want it, like we believe this is a perfectly valid thing for people to keep doing, we will encourage them to do so by shipping a new template such that when they say .NET new blah, they're going to get this API. It is weird that we have, I mean, it creates user confusion that we've got all these different create methods. You have to then understand what they all are. If it's just create application builder and create empty application builder, like that's relatively self-explanatory. But then there's this create default builder thing, and then that's where, at least for me, that's where I start getting really confused.
Okay, I'll log those two bugs. Hide/obsolete, create default builder, and then update the template, the worker template, to use.
Again, just something to talk about amongst people that know what they're talking about, which is not me.
No, I mean, this is good feedback. Like, this is kind of a wart.
So the other question I have is, like, I had this chat with Glenn at some point and Kathleen about the generic host builder for console apps. So what would happen if we were doing console? Would we tell people use create empty application builder, or would we create another one called create console application builder and then create empty console application builder? And that seems like another area where we should at least think about what would happen in this space to avoid that we just create more of those named things.
I mean, yeah, it seems to me, looking at what we have right now, that what we would probably want is everything forward should be based on empty, and then we should have a method of, like, register web defaults, or whatever that you can call, and register console defaults that you can call. And if you don't want to call the defaults, then build them yourself, instead of the constructor just doing things for you on the assumption that that's what you want.
Yeah, to Emo's question, I wouldn't suggest using create application builder for a console app, and the reason being is because that'll add an app settings.json file as a configuration to your app, and so all you would need to do is drop in a file named app settings.json next to your exe, and all of a sudden now you can configure the app to do things that potentially you shouldn't be able to.
So that's a fine answer. I guess what I'm asking is just because I tried to make the like basically create a WPF WinForms and console app that uses the host builder pattern, which basically boils down to I want to use DI, I want to use the same pattern of registering DI, registering configuration, and other things. And so I guess my question is, what would that look like? Like, what I kind of want to avoid is that we create more of these named methods, because for better or worse, it sounds a bit like create application builder specific to web, which is unfortunate because the name doesn't make that clear really. And so then that's kind of, I think, the conundrum that I'm asking is like, is this what's going to happen? Or,
I mean, specifically for Maui
too. Like, this is really a different mode. Like, it looks bad because we're doing this for trimming, right?
Well, then there's trimming, but then there's also the, is this the right shape for a console app / a WinForms app / a Maui app, right?
Right. Well, that's the goal of empty.
I think the answer to that is no. Like Maui, I explicitly took out hosting as a dependency, right? It just says, okay, I use DI, I use configuration, I use logging. WASM works the exact same way as well. It doesn't use host application builder, just because this stuff is kind of too fat, and it is too web specific in my opinion. I mean, people can use it in that environment, but it's just, again, like an app settings.json file, like nobody wants that in their Maui app, right? Or
so I will say,
I'm not pushing back on that. I guess then my question is, like, what API do we give those people, right? Are we saying there's a different class? Because clearly it's not host application builder at that point. It's something else builder, right? Probably, right?
So
in Maui,
this came
it was
up in the
Maui
last
application builder.
Right. And web application builder doesn't derive from host application builder, which is sealed. And like last time this came up, it's like, does there need to be an interface, right? And there's none that like methods can target. So like our recommendation is to not like target extension methods on host application builder, right? We would be like add services to iService collection or add configuration sources to iConfiguration builder. And like there are a handful of existing things that want to do like both at once, which we're able to do that with like the old iHost builder interface, but so far that hasn't been like a huge issue. But yeah. So the idea is to like to use the primitives, right? Like iService collection, like in basically follow the general shape, so people are familiar with it.
I didn't fully understand from that answer. If I was going to use something here for my console app or my whatever app, is the new API being proposed here a viable starting point, or is there something about it as well that is broken?
Or wrongly opinionated.
Wrongly opinionated. Like my hope from how this was described initially is that there is zero opinion. It is empty. There is nothing here. But it sounds like tying this to host application builder settings and host application builder actually still has some opinions in it. Is that true?
The only opinions is the host design, right? Like it has DI, it has a configuration. It's just those things are empty when you
Well,
start.
I think those are the things we want to use outside, right? I mean, this was the idea to say we want a generic host builder across all our app models, so we can tell people DI works the same everywhere if you wanted to, right?
Is it things like if you call host application builder and don't give it a configuration in the settings, that the default config provider that it has itself has opinions? Is that the concern? Like I assume that's where the app settings.json is coming in. Is unless you go out of your way to stop it, that this pipeline is going to put it there. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Today you have to pass in disable defaults to the app settings, the application builder settings, to not get the app settings.json configuration by default.
Well, but the whole point of create empty is it's functionally equivalent to disable defaults equals true, right?
Correct. Yep.
So create empty doesn't give you an app settings.json load by default.
Correct.
So then is there any downside to using that as the starting point for console WinForms WPF? Or if we had it at the time for Maui?
Because you said this would not be suitable for Maui, so what's not suitable about it?
I have a whole issue written up on it. I can paste in your. I have like 6 or 7 points.
I mean, how about I take this offline with you, because maybe we need to page in some more context. Maybe I should read the thing you wrote up, but I think my question is basically like, do we believe this API, create empty in particular, would be the unified starting point for application models? But it sounds like the answer might be still no, which is fine, but I think that would change the way I look at this class, because it seems to me this class is more or less tied to web as it is today.
It's not necessarily web, it's just like long running processes, right? Like services, right? Like,
Sorry.
It's more that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
I don't see it as like I want to build a client app, I'm going to use this.
Yeah, that was one of the problems I had with console. I basically had to kind of butcher the thing into submission to, I had like start async, and then, it doesn't make sense in a console app really, but yeah.
So I pasted the issue into chat. It is .NET MAUI issue 4393.
Right,
so it's like things like there's an environment concept, which are like development, staging, and production. The content route, right, which is like, again, that's kind of a web thing about where are you serving up content. The main part of host is there's hosted services, right, which are like these background things that are running in your process. Do you want that in a console app? I don't think so.
Right, and like you say that there's like no services in the empty case, and it's like it's close. There are a few, like the iHost lifetime, console lifetime, like you were saying.
I mean, those are
for long
those
running.
are critical though. You need
Exactly.
those services.
Absolutely.
Like it's
Absolutely.
implementation detail kind of thing.
Mhm.
Well, that is the host, right, to begin with. I think that I liked your explanation that you had that, because I asked the same question in the issue, and you basically said there's no, like, there's the only thing that gives you is the concept of a host, which basically comes with the I, right? And then everything else is kind of what you add to it. And the fact
Right,
that
for
the
instance-
host itself exposes itself via DI, I mean, you know, sure, these are services, but
Right. It's the host. It's the host itself services that it's
Yeah.
needed for it to run that are
Right.
there.
So like the thing I just talked about is what makes like what host application builder.build.run, right? Like exit when you get a sig term, and you can replace it to control the lifetime to be on some like other event. So those are like the fundamental level things.
Right. So this makes sense for console apps if they're building, a daemon process. Just going to run for a long time, receive requests via named pipe or whatever, do some things on them, and then eventually somebody's going to tell it to go away.
Yeah.
But the go read this file and do some math and write a different file type of program. It's not the layer that. It's not the mode that they're going to write their program in. So it's not unsuitable for console apps. It's just not generally suitable for console apps.
And like a big reason, even though we considered this, why like web application builder isn't a host application builder, is because like host application builder returns an iHost, just like the generic host does. So there's some commonality there. There's a lot of commonality. And in the web app place, we want you to be able to like attach middleware and endpoints after you like build and before you run. So like an iHost isn't like sufficient. So we return like a web application, which happens to be an iHost. But yeah, so there's a little bit more flexibility, like when you have like a very custom domain, I feel like ASP.core or Maui, where you want to expose like kind of additional features. I don't know if like Council, right, would be kind of have enough unique features to want to expose anything more than an iHost.
It's even weird though in console, right? Like there's this whole start and stop part of being of the host.
Right.
And what does that mean in this world?
Right, and do you need the content root concept necessarily to your point with Maui and all that? You do if you're like loading configuration from a relative path, right? Like if you're trying to add app settings or something.
I guess. Yeah.
But that's the thing we support. So
in my opinion, this hosting layer, it isn't the end all be all to all apps you'd ever want to build. Like I would not tell people you should or you must use this in every new application or even most in most types of applications. I think
So
if you
that
want to
part
make
I
a service
agree with.
type of thing,
Yeah, I think the one thing that we have discussed before is that it's somewhat, if you want to use the I in a WPF app, it's kind of, there's not really a convenient way or like a standardized way of doing that. So everybody kind of invents that in some way, right? And so there was some desire to provide some common things we do think would make sense in all applications, DI being one of them. The configuration could be another. I mean, whether you want to use DI is a different thing, right? But today you would basically, like, there's not really a doc page you could go to that would tell you how to use Microsoft extensions dependency injection in a WPF app. There is some third-party blog posts on this, and they basically all go via the hosting APIs, which, yeah, it's doable, but it is a bit of the square peg and the round hole problem, right? So I think we should probably take this offline and just decide, talk about if there's something we should be doing, and just limit this conversation for the hosting application model. And it seems like, based on what you said, it makes sense as the APIs are proposed right now. The create default builder is a bit of a ward, but that's, I guess,
I'll log 2 bugs on that.
the way it is, right?
Yeah, I'll log bugs for the default builder.
Yeah. So what I have on screen right now is squaring off the cut corners here. It bothers me a little, personally, that to get an empty application builder, you don't go to application builder, you go to host, which makes me wonder if we want static create empty on host application builder, but then we have the problem of we're mixing constructors and static creates, which also confuses people. So at this point, having said it, I'll just shut up.
So the only minor objection I'd have is lines 10 and 12. I really don't feel there's a need for those two, but if people feel it's strong, like this is how you design APIs, you have to have these, but you can do everything you want with 11, and I don't think people are going to, like, even 11, right? Like it's nullable, so you just pass in null. Is 10.
Yeah, I'm
Well,
fine removing them.
it's
Just
more
people were
the-
like, they look different, so I made them all look the same.
I mean, it's more like if you have an existing app that calls create application builder with args, right? It's not clear to me how I go from there to the one that takes settings, right?
You would say new settings dot args equals args, right?
Yeah, no, that's the part I probably would figure out, but then am I supposed to do anything else? Can I just leave it as that?
I mean, that'll
Like
get
the
you
same
this.
semantics?
That's what the constructor does. Or that's what this method does.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it won't be the same semantics, right? Because one has default behavior and one is empty. But
Yeah, module the default behavior. But I mean, that's to me, it's like kind of like, yeah, if I have to F12 into the definition of the source code to figure out what to call, I think you already lost half your audience, right? So it seems like it's a more straightforward translation if you just tell people like, hey, start with the empty one, and then the method shape is the same, and then you go from there, right? It just seems like kind of like you're mixing orthogonal things, right? On the one hand side, you're saying, start with something that doesn't have as many services, but also change the way you invoke me, which is kind of completely unrelated to this, to the first one, right?
I mean, if we leave out 10 and 12 but add 8, then the path would be move from calling args to create application builder providing the settings. Now you've learned how to do that. Now you can move over to empty. So there's still a path.
I mean, sure.
If we put just the original proposal, then you have to do learn two things at once. And maybe two things is too hard for people.
What happens if you don't specify settings, or you pass null, or you call the proposed one that's parameterless? There are some default values that are reasonable for settings that get picked up.
Yeah.
Use the environment the arcs, or do you just literally have no arcs?
Literally, line 10. If I call line 10, is my app usable?
I mean,
it's kind of not. But
11 was proposed, and you proposed it with a null settings. So what happens if you pass null?
the
Yeah,
same
how's
things
it
that
not
happen in
usable?
10.
Well, yeah,
it's
that
not,
of course.
it's not that it's not
Good.
usable, but like, so things that happen on the non-empty one, right? On the create application builder, like it's grabbing like environment variables, right? And then that's changing the values, like for content root, application name, app environment. So it kind of makes more sense that you can call create application builder and get a bunch of the settings from your from the environment or from the context in what you called.
Right.
Whereas in create empty application builder isn't going to do that.
So I think from our perspective, like we could never use it as ASP.NET Core because people have expectations about what these initial settings will be, which are not what they would be when they're null. But if you don't care at all about the application name or content root or environment because you're not using it, you're just like adding an iHosted service and you want it to run until SIG term, why not?
I guess I'm wondering if by adding lines 10 and 12 and by having line 11 have it be nullable, if we're actually leading people to a place where things won't behave the way they want it to. Like maybe we should force people to be explicit. And that's literally a question. I don't know the answer, but by adding lines 10 and 12, we seem to be encouraging folks to not be providing the very thing that it sounds like most applications should be providing.
Yeah, I mean, I added it because that's what I thought the collective room wanted, and I was just writing things. If all we cared about was adding line 8,
That feedback goes for line 11 also taking in nullable settings.
I originally had it non-nullable, and then Stefan and I had a conversation, and he was like, well, why does it have to be non-nullable? And I was like, well, I guess it doesn't have to be. And so then I made it nullable. that was kind of the line of thinking that got us here.
So
Very
what
minimal.
happens when you call today line 7? Do you basically use environment command line args as the args, or do you basically start with 0 args?
There's no command line args in that case for 7, but there are environment variables, right? Like you can put .NET _ environment, that would environment name or something. You could say development.
Sure. So that would basically
So-
mean if I currently use number 9 and I want to move to the empty one, I basically have to construct the settings and parse in the args, right? Just passing in null would not give me the behavior I want, right?
If you're going from 9 to 11, yes, you have to pass the args through to the settings.
Which is a
So all the
property
settings-
called args.
Right. So all the settings properties are nullable, other than the bool disable defaults, which has no effect on these new overloads. So like if we required it, someone could just like call the empty constructor on the settings, and it would be the same thing as passing a null right now.
And you're saying in the context of a web app, if I don't specify the other 6 parameters, my web app probably doesn't work, right? I probably have to have content root at least.
Well, your web app
environment or
doesn't.
something.
Your web app doesn't call these APIs. Your web app calls ASP.NET, and ASP.NET calls these APIs. In your web app will call web application.createBuilder
Or create Slim Builder.
I
or
gotcha,
Slim
yeah.
Builder. Yeah.
I see.
Or
So
empty
we're really
builder,
talking about
all it
like
gets is
ASP.NET literally calls the API. I was under the impression that the template is ASP.NET that calls the API, but you're
Oh
saying
no.
the
This
actual
is what-
framework does it.
This is what the point I was making about having a domain specific thing that doesn't even like derive from host application builder. It's just like using it internally as a implementation detail, but it has a very similar shape.
The only time you use this API is like the worker template, right? If you want to do a Windows service, systemd service, or just some sort of long running service,
Which you said the template today calls create default builder, right?
right?
Yeah, so then I literally don't care anymore because it sounds like that nobody's
Well, I mean,
calling the
there's
API
gonna be a
except
bug.
for the framework.
There's an incoming bug that says we should make the template move to create application builder.
I guess that's fine. But at that point, I kind of agree with Stephen. Then let's just start with the one method that takes settings, non-nullable, and then just say like, well, let's see where people like that. But at least we,
Yeah.
force
I mean, we
people
can make
to
8
listen.
to make. We can do line 8 to make people's, I don't know, OCD happy, or just to round out the edges, as Jeremy said it.
Square off the edges, but yes.
Square, yeah.
Right now we rounded them. We cut the corners.
Nothing like mixing metaphors.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I remember doing a student solo flight, and air traffic control told me to square off a turn, which meant don't turn yet. But because they told me to do things, I thought it meant turn now.
Which is
Yeah,
a
for clear
reasonable assumption,
instructions.
I would argue, but yeah.
And but the all right, so we want to not add 10 and 12, but we do want to add 8.
That's kind of what I heard, and it would probably remove the question mark, quite frankly.
Are we
I'm fine
removing
with-
the question mark on only 10?
Yes.
I would say so because I think for the other one you would call 7, right? Like, why would you have a nullable and like otherwise it's kind of like, well, is that the same as calling the other one with null?
I mean, line 8 is going to call line 17, and so it
Yeah.
kind of has to be question mark.
Ah, I see.
Because it's just a vanity call to the constructor.
Right. All 3 of the top ones
call.
are just vanity calls to the constructor.
But we think that if you're creating an empty application builder, we think it's semantically relevant that you should give us some settings.
Because that's the only way you can specify them.
Yeah.
Because the other ones, you can get them from the environment.
So one question I have is like, how does 10 actually help with linking? Is it because you special case this API?
So yeah, specifically, we're going to duplicate the 17 constructor and it's going to have a boolean said boolean empty equal, and it'll always be true. We'll debug that, assert that it's true, and then the two construct, it's going to be internal. Yep. Then the two constructors will call into some common code that's common between them, and the top constructor 17 will only do the non stuff, right? The non default stuff,
I see.
whichever way that works.
So you don't
And so-
actually special case it from the linker. You just refactor the implementation so that you don't have to interpret a dynamic value.
Right.
Right, exactly. Like the code will, if you only call through line 18 or constructor 18, none of that code ever gets marked and preserved.
Makes sense.
I'm happy with what's on screen now.
So the only thing I'm curious about is the nullability here, because they don't match.
I guess that's fair. Fine.
I mean, they're both new. We can decide to go either way. I said I'm personally think they probably should be nullable because, you could just not set any of the properties and it's the same behavior, which I think is easy to explain. I
Yeah.
also wonder though, is this source breaking? If someone's like just passing in the null literal, who would do that though? No one would do that. But do we care?
Oh, that's true. You can't add a second reference type constructor that accepts the null literal.
Because we consider null to be valid for args.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
It's sad though, because I did like adding that just to make the path clearer.
Yes, that is in our list of breaking changes of if you think that if in ULL is semantically valid to be written in a position, you can't overload now.
That's really sad though, because I can't imagine why you pass in a null literal when the empty constructor exists. But it's possible.
But it's okay to add them together when we added 16 and 17.
Right, because then
7.
null never would have compiled.
Right. Okay.
You would have had to have cast it to a typed null.
I mean, I would argue it is a source breaking change, but I would also say that might be sometimes acceptable. It's
Yeah,
not like
I think we should do it. I brought it up, but I honestly think it's okay. It's not nearly as breaking as retconning or something.
I mean,
I
I
don't
personally
think any
care
actual app-
less about breaking Microsoft Extensions hosting than I care about breaking, people calling something on, I don't know, a assembly.load. Like,
yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, that's what I said earlier. Like, if most of this code is called by infrastructure anyways, my killer level going down significantly.
Right. So my vote would be to make both of them nullable, but
I mean,
just make them match.
like create empty application builder can also throw if you gave it literally null on everything, and it could be saying like what you're doing makes no sense. What are you trying to build? And,
But it doesn't.
okay,
But that's not the case. Like it's fine.
okay. If saying you want one empty and it has no opinion, then we can add the question mark. It's just because null works doesn't mean you have to decorate it as nullable.
But I think it's
You can be saying null's a bad idea. All right, it's useful.
Ooh,
You guys are the feature owners.
you actually find something? Oh, good.
Are we good then for this one?
I think so.
Both nullable and source break. Like, do we have to document the source breaking change?
I think these kind of source breaking changes, I don't think there's a lot of value in documenting because it's. I think the biggest problem is behavior, where there's not an obvious fix, right? Or API breaking change where there's no obvious fix. Here the fix is the compiler literally tells you what the problem is. You just insert the cast.
Completely agreed.
Well, it's also why are you explicitly passing in null when there's a
Right.
overload that didn't take any parameters.
Right. That's why I almost didn't even say anything because I figured there was probably some stipulation against it, and I wanted the overload. But
No, it's good to bring up to remind us that.
yeah. But I'm like, yeah, for the good of the API review, we should at least consider it.
It's just another reason why overloading was a bad idea.
Yeah. If only we could statically analyze the setting of a bool property. Come on. No, just kidding.
Don't get Steve started.
All right.
I mean, on that note, his reflection was a very bad idea too.
Yes. Also, sometimes great. All right. Are we happy?
I am.
I mean, we spent 2 hours on 2 issues, so I think I'm the root cause for everything going slowly, because every time I'm not on the call, it seems like you approved 20 issues.
I was really surprised at how many we got through that time, especially since the agenda only had one item on it. Which, yes,
So we have
yes,
12
Minister,
minutes
is
left.
an agendum, but
I think there's one that I think we can get through in 12 minutes if we're game. Assuming we don't think we can do com source generator in 12 minutes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was assuming, but since we have Aaron on the call, are you okay with postponing?
There is no way.
I don't think we can even read this
anything
in
through.
12 minutes.
We can't even discuss the name of anything in 12 minutes.
Okay, fair enough.
That's mainly because of you, Emo. Mainly because of you. Just
I'm sorry. I owe you an interrupt call.
And I assume that the fourth thing on the agenda, the Xenerop stubs thing, is probably also more than 10 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're in two separate ones because the com one is more important, and the interop stubs one will probably take longer than the com one.
Alrighty. All right, Tobe.
So
Who's
I
your
think
lamb?
we can do the first one that's not red.
Asynchronously cancel a cancellation token source?
Yeah.
Cancel async. Does it take a cancellation token?
No. So today there's cancellation token source dot cancel, and we've had some requests for cancel async. So you can do task.run cts.cancel, and that achieves some of what people want. The problem is that you kind of don't want to spin up a task unnecessarily if there's actually nothing to cancel. If no one's registered with the cancellation token source, queuing a work item to cancel it is lame. Because the only thing that you're really, the thing that you care about here isn't transitioning the token from not canceled to canceled. It's all of the registered callbacks. When you call cancel, they're invoked synchronously as part of your cancel call. And if you don't want to do arbitrary work that others have hooked up, you want to be able to queue this to run asynchronously. But queuing it to run asynchronously if there's no one hooked up is lame. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is if you do that, if you call task.run, then you are not only asynchronously running the callbacks, but you're also asynchronously transitioning the token from not canceled to canceled. And so you kind of have to wait for that transition to happen. And if there's other stuff that you want to do immediately after, you have to wait for that work item to go and transition the task. Whereas what you really want is to immediately transition it from not canceled to canceled and to asynchronously execute any callbacks that there might be. And that's exactly what cancel async does. Basically, it synchronously transitions the token from, an interlocked operation, transitions it from not canceled to canceled. And then if there are registered callbacks, queues a work item to run them, returning a task that represents the eventual completion of those callbacks.
I think you lost me at the asynchronous transition from not non-cancel to cancel. Like,
So
why
if-
does this
if-
matter?
If you wanted to do something immediately after that was based on knowing that the token had cancellation requested, you can't do it immediately after. You have to wait for your task.run to run.
I see. You're saying there's a race condition basically if you don't do that. Yeah. Okay.
So if you do var task equals cancel async, you can assert like right after
Right
getting
after
the
that
task.
the token
Yeah.
isn't back canceled.
Yeah.
But the callbacks may not have completed yet.
All right. Quick joke: as an async API, it doesn't need a cancellation token. No, I'm just kidding. But in seriousness,
In all seriousness, it's something to
think it might?
consider, and I considered it and
Really?
said no, because people are gonna pass CTS.token, and like they're gonna pass the same token that they're canceling.
right?
At which point it becomes a very expensive no-op.
Well, that depends on if you check cancellation or no, because you'd have to set it to canceled. So it would set it to canceled and then skip all the callbacks.
Yeah, basically canceling, transitioning the token and then not invoking the callbacks would be like a reliability nightmare.
Right.
Yeah, that would that violate finalies from an async method?
It would violate a whole bunch of stuff.
Okay, so it would be bad. Don't do it.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it should be a pretty simple API. It's just
What
Okay.
happens on exceptions in the callbacks?
they'll be so. It's a good question. So today, there are actually two overloads of cancel. There's the default overload and there's an overload that takes a bool. By default, every callback is invoked, regardless of whether they throw exceptions, and then all of the exceptions that and you're not supposed to throw exceptions in the the callback, but if you do, they're all gathered up and they're thrown out of the cancel call as part of an aggregate exception. If you use the one that takes a bool, you can specify false, which basically says stop running the callbacks once an exception occurs, which no one ever does, and we would discourage you from doing because it means callbacks won't be invoked. And if we had to do it over, we wouldn't have that overload at all. So I have not duplicated it here, and instead you'll get the same behavior as you get with the cancel that's parameterless today, which is we will invoke all the callbacks. If any of them throws an exception, we gather up all those exceptions, and then that aggregate will be stored into the return task.
And you'll only get one aggregate exception, not an aggregate exception of the aggregate exception.
Well, the way I currently have it implemented is you will get an aggregate. If you await this task, it will throw an aggregate exception.
Right, but is that an aggregate exception wrapping the aggregate exception that cancellation did, or just wrapping all the exceptions from the cancellation?
So there's two possible things we could do. We could store all the individual, if 3 callbacks threw a format exception, we could store all 3 of those format exceptions directly into the task. If you then await that task, the first format exception will be propagated. The other 2 will be ignored. We could wrap all 3 format exceptions into an aggregate and store that into the task. And then when you await the task, it will propagate an aggregate exception that contains 3 format exceptions. The latter is what I propose and what I currently have implemented.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I was just making sure it wasn't that the task system, because I know that there's some level where it auto wraps things in aggregate exceptions.
So the task.exception property wraps all of its exceptions in an aggregate, and it doesn't pay any attention to what those are. So if you were to access task.exception, you would get an aggregate around 3 format exceptions.
Okay, but await will throw
the aggregate around 3 format exceptions.
Okay.
Basically, it's the exception property that's wrapping.
Okay, that's the part that I
or dot wait as well. Dot wait will also wrap in an aggregate exception. So in that case, if you synchronously blocked on this, you would get an aggregate around 3 formats.
Okay. So I take it from all this that you're actually proposing the first version where it's task instead of the second version where it's void.
Oh yeah, I'm proposing task.
Because there wasn't actually a proposal. In this issue.
You're right. Yeah, no, it's the first line.
Yeah.
Is the proposal.
So another kind of crazy thing, which probably is crazy this time, but who knows, is dispose also will block if like there's an ongoing cancellation calling callbacks, right?
Yeah. Dispose will synchronously. Well, sorry. Dispose on the cancellation token source will not block. That's a no-no. That we basically say that's not safe. Dispose on the cancellation token registration will block if the associated callback for that registration is actively running.
That makes sense.
And there is a dispose async that will asynchronously wait for the callback in that situation.
Got it.
Okay, so we just want what's on screen?
Yes.
what does it mean for threading? Are we literally scheduling the callbacks now on a worker thread, and we haven't done this before, or?
It means that rather than the synchronous call to cancel invoking every callback, it does basically task.run with a delegate that invokes every callback. So it's been queuing to the thread pool a work item that runs all the callbacks.
A work item that
callbacks-
runs all the callbacks instead of
A work item that runs them all serially.
Yeah.
So we're not. I think I considered having them run in parallel, each queued individually, and I decided that was a bad idea because you can have. We have uses of registration that
Is ordered.
or even if they're not ordered, they access resources where concurrent access to those resources would be problematic.
right.
Right.
Assuming that finally blocks are relevant in cancel patterns, it would mean that you would get what looks like linear exit of a finally scope that ran concurrently, which would probably be weird.
So, but if I register a callback, like, what is my generally assumption of which thread this runs on?
You don't have usually it's not you. So the typical pattern is like you're about to do, you're registering with a cancellation token around some scope, and your expectation is that somebody else concurrently with you are going to be canceling the token. So either by the time you've registered, cancellation has not been requested, in which case while you're running somebody else is going to invoke your callback, or by the time you call register, cancellation has been requested, in which case your call to register will invoke your callback. So from a threading perspective, you are generally prepared for somebody else to be doing the work.
Makes sense. Okay.
Is there, if you're in an async method and you've created your own cancellation token source and you are canceling it, is cancel, I'm pretty sure that an analyzer now is going to see you have cancel and cancel async, and if you are async, you should call async. Is that going to be misappropriately applied here, or is it still a reasonable
So there is
assumption?
such an analyzer, and it is off by default because it gets things like that wrong. Because there are plenty of situations in which you don't want to call the async thing, even if you're in an async method. So yes, it would very likely warn about that.
But why would this be wrong? Like, it sounded like you generally want to do cancel async.
Well, it depends on your situation. If you are okay running the callbacks yourself, then cancel's fine. If you're not okay, then you want to call cancel async. Like
Would you mostly
if the only things that are registered with it is your own work, like you're in your own closed system. You create a cancellation token source, you register with it to do something, and then you cancel it yourself at some point in response to some signal. Like, it's probably no reason to do it asynchronously. If you're handing out the cancellation token to arbitrary other things in the system, and now you want to cancel all of that arbitrary work, it's a good chance that, and you're in an async context, then cancel async could very reasonably be the thing that you want.
Is this cancel going to automatically discard things like the execution context? Is this run or run unsafe?
This would be run.
Okay, so it will continue all your async locals and stuff into that flow. And
I mean, it logically doesn't matter because every callback, like there's register and unsafe register. It's the registration that captures the execution context.
Okay.
So the callbacks are what handle the execution context flow. They pick the registration of the callback is where the execution context is flowing from, not from the call to cancel.
Okay.
But,
Yeah, so
but
my
Steven, based
question.
on what you said is like, it sounded to me like you either don't care whether it's asynchronous, but there's nothing wrong with running it asynchronous most of the time, right? Unless you have some really crazy threading situation, right? So I guess you could say when people default to that, well, there's really nothing wrong with
It's nothing.
preferring that over the synchronous version.
I mean, it's going to, well, 99% of the time, it wouldn't be wrong. It might be more expensive than it needs to be.
Like, I would imagine one of the primary use cases for this would be in a non-async context when you have like a lock and you want to like store the task for
Right. You want to
later.
escape. You want to trigger cancellation while transitioning the token to be canceled.
Right. With some
Inside the
other
lock.
state. Right.
Ensuring that you're not invoking arbitrary code while holding the lock. Yeah.
Like dispose. Though you'd probably want to wait on the task too. To your earlier point about not disposing the source while the registrations are running.
Right.
Makes sense.
Okay. But yeah, so my question regarding the analyzer is, do we really want to be canceled async, where you get the, oh, should I call the synchronous or asynchronous, or do we think they're kind of different scenarios and we want a different name? But if they're close-ish enough-ish, then we can just ship this.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we didn't want to call it cancel async, I think we'd basically, it would be like, I don't even know what it would be.
Well, like we could
dispatch.
We probably want to separate. We probably want to separate the queuing from the joining, like the forking. So we basically have like a transition to canceled and queue work items that's void, and then a separate wait for pending work async or something.
That'd be weird because people never call the wait for pending work or whatever. Oh, you mean just have the task that is we've done the dispatching, but now you have a thing you can await.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, like we could also say cancel asynchronously, and we've just spelled out asynchronously, so it doesn't trip the analyzer that says like.
I wouldn't.
You should call an async version if you're in an async version. So
I wouldn't do that.
I mean, basically everything I've heard is the normal problem when you go from sync to async, right? So like in that case, it's really not any different from any other overload that ends in async, right? It's just, well, it has all the semantics that it has when it runs asynchronously, which you may or may not want.
I think it's one more case of, you've got memory stream.read async. Your analyzer is going to tell you to change your read to read async, even though there's zero benefit to doing so.
Exactly.
But it's 99% of the time it's not going to hurt other than adding a little overhead. So I think that the work there is to make the analyzer better if we're ever going to enable it by default.
Yeah, it makes more sense to me that the analyzer would add more special cases for known APIs. That seems more, I think, scalable than the idea of us inventing new naming conventions every time we have this nuanced discussion.
Right. Well, in things like memory stream, this is from the abstraction, it's right that you want to call the async from async, but from the implementation, it's wrong. And in this one, it's like there's not even an abstract, or like there's no abstraction here, so it's did we want to dissociate the method groups? And if you think they're fine, like I just wanted to ask the question, so we had an answer.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
Okay.
I was off by 6 minutes. Sorry.
I mean, 6 minutes is within reason, I think.
Yeah. Given that the first thing ran at 300% of my estimate, you running at 150 is you're winning today. So you
Sounds
got
good.
that you totally Price is Righted this.
Thanks, everyone.
I
Bye
should
bye.
actually hit post and hit approved and all those things. All right, and now that we get to look at my head pointing in two different directions because of mirror mode, thanks everybody for joining us, and see you next week, same .NET time on the same .NET channel. Yeah, the gavel's just for you, Internet. Ciao.